Welcome to the program, Colonel Sweet.
Hey, thank you for having me back on, Daniel.
Head of the Ukrainian military intelligence, General Kirill Budanov, says that Russia would launch another offensive in the Sumy region. If it is the case, what would it mean for the Ukrainian army?
Well, it certainly complicates the ground situation for the Ukrainian army that's already extended. And what it does is just that it further extends them to have to protect additional terrain, which means they have to pull units off of the line in other positions to fortify the positions in Sumy. So that's dangerous, but it also allows Russia to dictate the conditions on the battlefield, which is not a position that Ukraine wants to be in. The reaction mode is not a good position to be in with the Russian forces right now.
From your perspective, what could be the solutions for the Ukrainian army in case of another offensive in the Sumy region? Active defense or maybe positional defense in the trenches?
Well, unfortunately, right now, it's a positional defense. They're fighting from the trenches, but a mobile defense is probably within the best course of action. But by doing that, they have to yield terrain to an aggressor, which means that they're going to have to eventually go and get that terrain back. What they need to be doing, or what they need to be allowed to do, is to interdict Russian forces before they arrive on the battlefield. And right now, the United States and the West is not authorizing Ukrainian military to use the weapons and munitions that are provided to strike targets on the other side of the border. By striking targets on the other side of the border, they can control the flow of Russian forces coming into the battlefield. Otherwise, they're fighting that close fight every day, and they're allowing Russia to dictate conditions on the ground.
Head of the Ukrainian military intelligence, General Budanov, also said that there was an indication of potential for stabilization on the front lines in the Kharkiv region. Does it mean that Russians cannot meet their war objectives in the Kharkiv region?
Well, I'm not sure it means that at all. I mean, stabilizing the front is temporary. I mean, it could be 24 hours, it could be a week. What happens is that Russians continue to bring forces across the border. The numbers that we saw about a week ago was 30,000 were amassed that were going to launch the offensive towards Kharkiv. And the anticipation was that there were 15 to 20,000 additional soldiers that were ready to come across the border based upon where success was met. So stopping an assault in one area does not necessarily stop the overall assault across the Kharkiv Oblast. So it's a very dangerous situation, and one in which the Ukrainian military just needs additional capacity. And when I say capacity, it's those weapons and the ammunition that the West and, in this case, France and Czechoslovakia, in the form of artillery rounds, they need that today. There needs to be a sense of urgency today to get that equipment to them. And right now, we're hearing weeks in maybe early June. And quite frankly, that's going to be a tough. That's a tough ask for the Ukrainian military.
From your perspective, what would it take for the Ukrainian army to stabilize the front lines in the Kharkiv region for a long-term perspective?
Yeah, again, it comes down to winning the war in interdiction. They have to stop the flow. Ukraine's done an amazing job, a spectacular job in the close fight. They are literally killing, according to British intelligence, upwards between 750 to 1,000 Russians a day, and in tanks and APCs and artillery. They're doing a great job doing that, but they're doing that job every day, and it just keeps coming and coming. And as a result, the Russian forces are able to incrementally seize terrain. What I see is that 5 miles to date push into Ukraine. And, you know, as they're pushing into Ukraine, they're fortifying those positions behind the advances, because their goal is to create a sanitary zone, as Putin has said. So they're playing a long game, which is to hold that terrain and ultimately try to bring Ukraine to the negotiation table by influencing the West to push them there.
From your perspective, what would it take for the Ukrainians to liberate such, to destroy this buffer zone between our borders?
Well, the first thing it takes is, and again, I'm going to keep saying this, the first thing it is to stop the flow of forces coming in. If you can stop the flow of forces, the battles that are going to occur 2 to 3 days out, and fight the close fight, and then push them back and create space for your maneuver elements. Now, I use the word maneuver element because what they need is APCs, armored personnel carriers. They'll need tanks. They need self-propelled artillery. But equally as important is those F-16s that are providing close air support that we hear, that we continue to hear, will be there in May, June. But it has to be a combined arms fight. And right now, it's just a defensive fight from foxholes.
I would like also to cover Russia's chances to capture Kharkiv. What is your take on that?
It's going to be it'll be a tough fight. Right now, it's a slow, methodical fight. It's an encirclement. It's classic Russian offensive. It's an encirclement of the town, of the city, and it's through mass and volume. What you're seeing is, again, 30,000 with an additional 20,000, upwards of 50,000 soldiers in just volumes of artillery. Ukraine has to be able to take out that artillery, and then they have to deal with the dismounted forces that are coming in. That's done through, quite frankly, through interdiction again, but also those 155 rounds that they need, plus their munitions, and a static defense. A mobile defense is good, but you have to have some sort of counter to a mobile defense.
Many military experts and analysts does not think that Russia have a military capacity to capture Kharkiv right now. Do you support such point?
Well, they may not, because a number of things. And most importantly, to me, it comes down to experience, okay? All the elite formations within the Russian military have been seriously attrited, if not destroyed. So what you're getting right now are, in a sense, the conscripts, the foreign fighters, the mercenaries that are doing the bidding. And they're just being thrown into the fight. I've seen videos, I'm sure you've seen them too, of Russian soldiers marching towards the front without armor or artillery, and in many cases without any weapons on their hands. They're just marching forward towards the front. The idea is to attrit, is to force Ukraine to fire all their munitions and bring them to a point where they have to withdraw. Again, slow, methodical gains. I mean, 100 yards here, 100 yards there, but Russia is gradually moving forward. It has to be stopped, and the only way to stop it is to stop it on the other side of the border, is to interdict them.
How do you see the current Russia's war objectives in the Kharkiv region? Try to capture Kharkiv, or just to stretch Ukrainian forces along the border near Russia to force Ukraine to relocate forces from other important areas?
Sure. No, it's a strategy of both. At the end of the day, Kharkiv is the prize, okay? And Mark Toth, my writing colleague, and I have discussed this. Kharkiv has the potential of being the bastion of the Ukraine war. And of course, Bastogne was a critical battle during the Second World War, in which the German forces launched their final counteroffensive to try to repel the Allied forces as they're marching towards Germany. This ultimately could be that bastion on both sides. It's a final push. It's a last push, if you will, by Russia to get a sizable gain. In this case, Kharkiv, the second largest city in the country, but also from Kharkiv, it allows them an axis of advance into Kiev. So it's very important for both sides, the outcome of this particular fight. If the Ukrainian military can stop the push from Kharkiv and then be able to push the invading forces back across the border, that would send a tremendous message, one to the West and to Ukraine, but also to Russia.
Earlier you mentioned about the 30 or 50,000 Russian soldiers near the Ukrainian borders. Would it be enough for the Russian side, such quantity of soldiers, to capture Kharkiv or to go even forward?
I don't think it's enough to capture the city. No, it's enough to extend the lines. That's true. And again, let's go back to the so the first objective. It would be in the best course of action for Russia would be to secure the city. The second best would just be to secure terrain and establish that buffer zone that we've talked about, the sanitary zone. That gives them, from their perspective, terrain that gives them bargaining power. But it also affords them the ability to move artillery into those positions, long-range artillery that can shoot deeper into Ukraine. And that's the worst-case scenario for right now, the Zelensky government.
You mentioned about that idea of Russian dictator Putin to create a buffer zone between the Ukrainian and Russia's border. Does it mean that Ukrainian strikes on Belgorod and other regions are really damaging Putin's reputation, his regime, and inflicting heavy losses on the Russian side?
Yeah, so Kharkiv's been a bit of an embarrassment for the Putin regime since the onset of the war. They were not able to secure it in the opening days of the war. They lost a lot of terrain in the initial counteroffensive, in which the oblast was taken back, almost in its entirety by Ukrainian forces. But it's also, as you just said, Belgorod, it's the anti-Putin forces that have launched attacks from the Ukrainian side of the border into Russia. That's been an embarrassment, too, that it can't secure its own terrain. So it's a mixture of all of the above. At the end of the day, though, it's going to have to be a direct fight, a deep fight, a multi-domain fight. And it can't just be limited to what's going on in Kharkiv. There's got to be pressure throughout. There's got to be pressure in Crimea. There's got to be pressure in Russia. There's got to be pressure elsewhere. It can't be a fight that Russia dictates. And right now, they're reacting to Russia, and they're losing the initiative. Ukraine is an army of maneuver. They're fighting well in the defense, but they maneuver well. So they need more capacity, particularly with tanks and APCs.
Let's also cover the role of the U.S. security assistance for the Ukrainian war effort. Is U.S. military aid going too slow to Ukraine?
In my opinion, the answer is yes. Look, when I was in the 101st Airborne Division, when we were on division readiness status, an infantry brigade could be lifted within 18 hours and deployed anywhere in the world. So why we can't get the munitions that are required for Ukraine to fight and win within days after signing the $61 billion aid package, quite frankly, for me, is a big question. I just don't understand why it's taken days, weeks, and we're getting ready to close in on a month to get that equipment forward. Now, some of it is forward, some of it was pre-positioned, but the bulk of it is still flowing. It's the same with the munitions that the Czech Republic and France have secured, 180,000 155 rounds. So we've been talking about that for months, and here it is. Now we're being told it won't be till June. So there's a sense of urgency that's missing. Ukraine can continue to defend, but they're taking losses. And if it gets to a point where they can't backfill the forces that are forward, and that's the danger point. That's the point we're getting close to, and that's what Russia's counting.
But is it possible for the Pentagon to deliver all of security assistance to Ukraine very fast? From a technical point of view, is it possible to do it in a matter of days or weeks?
Well, it's complex, and I certainly don't understand the entire logistics footprint, but getting the materials from the United States to Europe is one thing, but then getting the materials from the forward positions in NATO into Ukraine and then forward to the battle positions, that's where logisticians earn their money, And I'm certainly not a logistician, but I do think we could go fast.
Also, you mentioned about the battle in the Kharkiv region. If all American aid is in Ukraine, how would it influence the battleground in the Kharkiv region and Ukrainian ability to fight back, to repel Russia's attack on the east of Ukraine and especially in the Kharkiv region?
Well, it certainly comes down to the weapon systems that are provided, okay? It's not just $61 billion worth of equipment. More doesn't necessarily win the war. It's the type of equipment. ATACMS are critical, but the ATACMS is only good if you can fire it across the border to interdict. Now, they're able to fire those ATACMS into Crimea, and that's good. Look, UK has authorized Storm Shadows to be fired across the border, but they just don't have enough Storm Shadows to do the mission. No, it comes down to the equipment. The first thing that $61 billion is going to be used for is to stop the bleeding, okay? But the White House has come back and acknowledged that that's only intended to help Kiev in its current position, that more funds will be necessary in order to conduct an offensive, at least what Jake Sullivan, a national security advisor, stated a couple of weeks ago as a counteroffensive in 2025. So that's looking a little deep. We need to be looking, within the next week, not 6 months from now.
But is it possible to launch counteroffensive if your enemy is moving forward and is also conducting offensive operations?
It is. The first step, again, is to stop the bleeding. So you have to stop the advancement, and you need artillery for that. Cluster munitions, in this case, for dismounted infantry that are moving in the area. But you need counter artillery, take out their batteries. That's their strength. The number one producing casualty weapon for Russia is artillery. So you have to take that out. You have to remove the soldiers that are coming forward, but then you have to address what's coming the next day and the next day. You need to create space. Right now, there's no space. There's just day after day after day of close contact because they're not allowed to strike targets in Russia.
Let's cover also some weapons, American weapons. Politico reported that American drone MQ-9 Reaper would be the #1 priority for the Ukrainian war effort. What is your take on this particular weapon?
It's a good weapon system, okay? It's a very effective weapon system that we've been using on the war on terrorism for years. But it's only a single weapon system, okay? You need the combination of multiple weapon systems and platforms. It's a great system to go after high payoff targets, high value targets. And when I say that, I mean counter battery radars, EW systems, those type of systems that blind the Russians from seeing the battlefield and enabling your maneuver. So it's a good system for that, taking out command and control headquarters in key weapon systems on the battlefield, but it needs to be in conjunction with a multitude of weapons. It's a combined arms warfare. A single weapon platform is not going to be a difference maker.
There have been discussions on long-range ATACMS systems for months. How do you see the current effects of this system on the ground in Ukraine, current results of its deployment to Ukraine?
So today we've seen the ATACMS used in Crimea. We've seen the ATACMS used against other targets within the borders of Ukraine. But the value of the ATACMS, from my perspective, it has a range of 190 miles, and it's a highly effective system. I would use the ATACMS to go after those launch sites, the cruise missile ballistic launch sites and drone launch sites. Those are the ones that are inflicting the casualties on the civilians and the energy infrastructure. You have to be able to strike back against them. Those are being launched from deep within Russia, and that's the weapon system, probably the best weapon system to go after them, other than some of the organic UAV systems that Ukraine's put together, or that Ukraine has developed on their own. But it's a powerful system. It sends a shock and awe, and the Russians are very much worried about that particular system. Just look at what HIMARS did during the initial counteroffensive, and then take that effect and move that effect 190 miles into Russia. That's the impact it has. That can totally disrupt Russian logistics.
U.S. Department of State does not expect any serious Russia's breakthrough on the ground. The White House's John Kirby also said that. Do you also think so?
I think they're overly optimistic. the effect, the cumulative effect of days, weeks, and months of direct combat, of artillery explosions going off around you, of daily assaults. That effect is traumatic, and it will have lasting effects on the men and women who are fighting that fight. So I think, again, overly optimistic. That sense of urgency needs to be instilled. It's a tough call, but I just don't agree with that. I mean, look, they are making gallant, heroic defenses, but to maintain that, it's going to be very difficult, and you're going to have shattered lives because of it.
Also, Russian dictator Vladimir Putin removes Sergei Shoigu from the Ministry of Defense in the middle of the war. What can be the reasons for such decision?
Well, we're 28 months into a war in which Russia probably has not ceded more terrain than they did when they started. Okay, they gained terrain, they lost terrain. It's a stalemate, and I suspect, from Putin's perspective, that he wants something different. But what he wants now is, by bringing in a new Minister of Defense who has a strong economic background, is the messaging that's being sent by Moscow is a protracted war. This is going to play out longer. They're putting Russia on a war footing, particularly within their defense industrial complex. And that's a message being sent to the United States, is that, and to the West, is that we're not going to stop. We're actually going to ramp up, and we're going to continue this war against Ukraine until we win, or until we get the results that we're looking for. Initially, those results obviously were to overthrow the government. I think they may actually get to a point where they would consider terrain, but Russia has a bad reputation for living up to their commitments for treaties. So I can't think that Ukraine would ever type of compromise and negotiate it into this war.
Also, there have been lots of speculations about possible ground deployment to Ukraine by some NATO members. There have been a statement from Estonia. Also, Prime Minister of Lithuania, Ingrida Šimonytė, is ready to deploy troops to Ukraine, for example, for training purposes, but such troops could be covered by Western anti-aircraft systems, and it could close, for example, a part of the sky of Ukraine. What is your perspective on such plans, and can such deployment of troops to Ukraine really change the course of the war, even if they are deployed not to a combat zone, but to other areas of Ukraine where there are no combat operations?
Sure. Look, outside of France, the countries that have spoken the loudest about deploying troops into Ukraine to support Ukraine are coming from the Baltic states, and I believe Poland, as far as massing soldiers along the border, and that, quite frankly, is because they have lived under the rule of Russia, and they understand the consequences of Russia winning in Ukraine and then refitting and resetting and coming after the Baltic states and Poland. So from that perspective, I understand what they're doing and the message that they're trying to send to Russia, which is that we're not going to let Ukraine fail. Mark Toff and I have spoken in a couple articles that we've written about the establishment of no-fly zones over Western Ukraine, for two purposes. One, and the most important, is to provide an umbrella, a shield, a safety net for Ukrainian civilians that are being indiscriminately slaughtered and targeted by the Russians. But also, it affords the opportunity to get humanitarian aid in, and helps to rebuild in those areas. They don't have to live underneath the threat of Russian missile attacks.
Thank you, Colonel Sweet, for your time and for your support for Ukraine. Glory to Ukraine.
Thank you for having me back on, Daniel. I appreciate it.